Hey everybody, how we doing? Welcome to Entitled My Friend's Opinion. We're happy to have you. I'm going to take a little minute. I'm going to be honest with you. This past week, I've eaten nothing but food from the deli and food from the Chinese place down the block that just says food period bakery. It's been terrible. Terrible, terrible, terrible. And I'm going to tell you about why you should not live like me. Wonderful company that has chosen to sponsor our podcast and help us get this message out to you, and that is Blue Apron. Blue Apron. I'm going to be honest. I don't know that much about Blue Apron other than how convenient, cool, awesome the food is. They send you food in a refrigerated bag box thing, basically a box with ice packs. Send it to your door with the instructions of how to cook the food. You're going to get a full meal that you can cook in under 40 minutes. Everything is locally sourced, responsibly grown. That means they're not packing a bunch of animals into tiny ass buildings. You can feel good about the food you're eating and feel better than I do now after that terrible chicken cutlet sandwich I just had from the deli down the corner. So please go into the description of this podcast, this one right now. Go ahead. Good. I'll take the time. Open it up. There you go. And click on that link to get $30 off your first order of Blue Apron to get awesome ready to make food with instructions. It's going to teach you how to cook new food so you can start feeling like an adult, moving forward, really getting into the groove of things, of feeling like, hey, you know what, this whole life thing, I got this. We're also brought to you by The Future of Healthcare. The Future of Healthcare is an amazing podcast by our good friend of the podcast, good supporter of the podcast, Nathan Dollinger. At some point during this podcast, Josh says something like, there's no way the United States could ever go on a universal healthcare plan. I think that's kind of bullshit, although he's probably right in the sense that it would be a very big change because of our free market healthcare plan that we have now. If this is something you have no idea what I'm talking about, or you know exactly what I'm talking about, and this is something you're really interested in, The Future of Healthcare is the perfect podcast for you. Nathan does such a great job of bringing on amazing guests. The last one he just put out was the CEO, a past CEO of a hospital, and he does such a good job of organizing his questions from these health professionals, so people who have no experience with the health field or have years of experience with the health field can learn a little bit more about something that is literally, that system is so crazy in our country, and so many people, everyone engages with it at some point in their life, unfortunately, in a lot of ways. But so many of us have no idea what goes on in the background of that world. So I think it's a really important podcast that people go listen to. That's The Future of Healthcare. You can go, not now because you're gonna stick with the entitled family here. You're gonna stick with us. But after this episode, you can go listen. The Future of Healthcare. Search that in the podcast app. You can also go to wearethefutureofhealthcare.com and check out the episodes there. Nathan does a great job of describing his guests and giving a little bit background there. So it's definitely something that I want anyone that listens to this podcast to go listen to. Nathan's also has an episode with us. I'm blanking on the number of which it is, but you can just search Nathan Dollinger as well, and I'm sure it'll come up in your podcast app with us, that he kind of breaks down the things he does. Him and Josh took a good afternoon and did that one. So that's a really great episode. I hope you listen to it first. Of course, you're going to commit to this episode, and then go search up The Future of Healthcare in your podcast app. I think that's it. I think we're all done. I've been talking for way too long for this intro. So without any further ado, we're going to break down a little bit of the Stockley verdict that just came out last week when I'm releasing the podcast. And then we'll break down the response in St. Louis with the protests, both on St. Louis University's campus and then also in the Central West End, which is one of the more affluent areas in St. Louis. And then we take the time to look at more holistically, looking at the entire United States and a little bit of history. What is the efficacy of protests? These things that we jump to as kind of the response. It's almost, other than voting, it's one of those only powers that we have as the people of the United States to check the government. And I think we need to take the time to say, like, is this a sufficient power? Are protests good enough to make change? We don't get answers to that question at all. We never come, this podcast is more about finding questions than finding answers. But I think that these are important things to start thinking about of why might it be in the government's interest to have us protest rather than making meaningful change? What is the differences between an effective protest and an ineffective protest? These are all really fun questions to ask and think about, and we had a really great time doing it. So, without any further ado, enjoy the episode.
Well, hello there, Entitled family. This is a big episode because finally your three hosts are back together for the first time in almost a month, surprisingly, and sadly, I might add. But I know it's been very busy with the start of school. 2 teachers and 1 student. Maybe that's the new name of the podcast.
2 teachers, 1 student. I like that.
No, that's no.
Every time you guys come up with names for podcasts, they're so inappropriate.
Sorry, Entitled family. We try to keep this to be
Last time you called it the three-way podcast.
I still don't understand why it's not like Menage a Trois or something. Like,
yeah. Well, other than that, Brian and Bob, how is the teaching jobs going?
you start, Bob.
Oh, dude, it's awesome. This was my second week of school, so we started right after. Was that Labor Day?
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually am going. I was just telling the guys off the air. I'm going on a camping trip with my class for Monday through Wednesday. So we're gonna go upstate New York, and it's gonna be a time where like I get to know the kids more. They get to know each other more. I think it's really gonna be beneficial to like. One, I'll learn all of their names, and we'll know like a little bit more personal about each other. So then when we come back to the classroom, like we'll have a relationship that I can work on rather than it just being kind of, that awkward stranger who is this white dude in my classroom. So I'm really excited for tomorrow and then, everything thereafter.
So is that a Teach for America criteria, or is that a like school?
No,
school
so
thing?
It's completely. So for those of you who are not familiar, Teach for America, the program sets you up with a school. So basically they set you on interviews, and then wherever you interview, whatever school that is, then you're just an employee of that school. So I work at a school. I'm not going to name the name, but it's an expeditionary learning school. And one of the things that is a tenement of expeditionary learning is a thing called crew, which is basically a homeroom that every single day I meet with the same 13 kids, and I basically serve as their one first point of contact with the school, but we go through team building, we go through leadership, we go through like goal creation, and then also I'm kind of their mentor for classes. And so a part of that is we go on retreats in 6th grade, they go on a retreat in 9th grade, and they go on a retreat in 12th grade. And it's really supposed to, so you create, like I'll be working with my crew, those 13 kids, and we'll be doing like leadership activities together to grow closer to each other. And then it's also like, so they get to know each other all throughout the school. So there should, by the end, when they graduate in 12th grade, they should have a nice relationship with all their teachers, but also every student in the school. It's actually a really cool aspect of my specific school that I'm really lucky to be a part of.
That's really, really interesting, and I really appreciate that they do that. I remember I lived right by an expeditionary school in Denver, and they what they do is really, really cool, and it's a unique way to learn and teach people. And then we'll toss it to Brian, who's teaching in a almost completely opposite environment.
Yeah, extremely different environment, and I'm teaching in essentially the suburbs of Kansas City, and I don't like suburbs. Kansas City school, though, and the kids I teach they're great. I'm teaching sophomore theology and subbing left and right for pretty much every single class that you could. Tomorrow, actually, I'm subbing for an English class, and English is more my trade than theology. And I thought I was going to be kind of stepping in for the catcher in the rye, and I emailed a few of my high school teachers and got some notes from them. Then I went and checked my mailbox, and it's actually one of my favorite Hemingway stories, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. So I'm
That's a good
stoked
one,
to
man.
plan that one. And it's just been a really rewarding experience. Like Bob, it's not necessarily a direct employment program. It's through a volunteer service called Alum Service Corps, and that's run through the central and southern province of the Jesuits in the United States. But similar to Bob again, is now I'm a full-time faculty member at my high school. So whatever I do, I report to the high school. I actually ended up in Colorado on a chess team trip and didn't see the chess team for 3 days. They kind of dropped me off and said, "We'll let you know if we need you." They didn't have a place for me to stay, but that worked out well. I had a few places to stay anyway, and it's really been a blast. It's a similar environment to where I went to high school, which means it's not at all like where Bob is. It's not inner city. Vast majority come from well-to-do white families in the suburbs. I'd like to see a little bit more diversity, and there is a really cool effort with this program that brings in underprivileged kids starting in 6th grade and catches them up to speed and gets them ready for high school. So working with students like that has been wonderful. It's been rewarding. And actually tomorrow, I think I'm going to take some of the, and by the time this drops, probably yesterday or today maybe, take some of the tenets that we talk about in this podcast episode and bring them to these kids that I'm teaching who are all suburban or not all suburban, but largely suburban, largely coming from a significant amount of money and largely white. So it's going to be a good conversation we have today, guys. And teaching's great. Being a student was great, and the classroom itself it feels like a good place.
Right. I think that I think we're probably going to end up having a podcast where me and Brian compare experiences. I also know we wanted to talk about restorative justice versus normal or traditional practices of punishing students. But also, I just think like designing a curriculum or figuring out like how to teach or what is important to teach or thinking about what would I want a person to come away with in the end, like how do I want them to grow, is such a beneficial experience for everyone. Like I think that's like, yeah, me and Brian are teaching in very different areas, and I think there's actually a lot of similarities too, which is cool as well to see. But like just that the constant resetting of like what do I want these students to come away with, like what are the things that I learned in my life that are really beneficial, and then also like how am I learning from this. It's like such a beneficial personal, something so personally beneficial. Like I'm constantly readjusting myself because I have to constantly be thinking about others. I think it's really such a unique experience.
Yeah, that's really well said. I've had pretty similar experiences, and there's a balance. The work-life balance is, I think, even kind of extreme in a teaching setting. Well, first of all, Bob, what class do you teach?
So I teach living environment, which is a course that's all around a standardized test, but it's basically just 9th grade biology.
Okay, and I teach sophomore theology. So I don't know how you set your class up, but mine is many reflections and writings and papers they have to do. So like the time commitment is enormous. So it's fully giving myself often maybe 12 to 16 hours a day if I've got a soccer game with the varsity team. But it's been so rewarding in that self-reflection and evaluating why I'm doing things, what the students need, and basing my activities and my grading and my classes on where those students themselves seem to fit.
Totally. Oh yeah, it's a huge time commitment. Especially, I mean, theology is one thing because I think it's like geared to. I guess that depends on how you teach it, but I would say could be more traditionally said geared towards discussion. Science is not that at all.
Yeah.
Which I like really battle with, because the thing I'm really trying to push for my students is like in the scientific world, this is a discussion. Like the classroom that you've grown up in for science does not mirror academic science. Academic science is so much more of a discussion, disagreement, just trying to figure things out. And that's what I'm really trying to push. But I'm sure, as you've probably seen too, it's really hard to do that when you have like the school standards and the state standards in your back that are like,
Yeah.
you have to teach these things too. So it's
Yeah.
it's a hard balance. Balance is in teaching is very, very difficult.
What's nice for me is being at a private school. We still have standards, but it's fewer standards.
Right.
So I do have a little bit more freedom, and I love that because theology, I don't think is something that you can pigeonhole into one point of view. And it would be mightily dangerous to have, as does happen sometimes, a school that looks at an ideology and sets it as its one course without much question. So I'm grateful that my school lets me be pretty open with where I go with it.
I'm sure both of you will come away with just a completely new respect for teaching and teachers and the struggle that goes on every single day inside classrooms. It's a really interesting field to go into, so I'm glad that you two get to be a part of it. Brian, I do want to have you lead off with the topic that you wanted to get into and discuss, and it's certainly something that's going on here in St. Louis, the Stockley trial. And nationally, though, I don't think a lot of people are going to know about it. So, Brian, do you want to go into some of those details and kind of set it up a little bit?
Yeah, so at the time of this recording, September 17th, 2017, we are just about 37 months removed from the last sort of scene like this in St. Louis, which was the killing of a young black man at the hands of a St. Louis police officer. There's much more nuance to it than just that. So I'll go through what we know, what I know, and we'll kind of go from there. And this happened way back in 2011. So the incident I referenced first, the Michael Brown death, that was 2014, August 2014. This is back in 2011, so 3 years beforehand. And Anthony Lamar Smith, who was 24 years old, was a black St. Louisan, and Jason Stockley was patrolling the area in St. Louis where he found Smith allegedly being a participant in some sort of drug deal. And so Stockley and his partner chased after Smith in a car. This police chase grew into much more than a police chase, and ultimately Stockley told his partner to crash his car into into Smith's car in order to stop him. What ends up happening afterwards is Stockley shoots Smith 5 times through the window. What resulted from that was a trial that ended 3 or 4 days ago now.
Yeah.
And I think on Friday the verdict was announced. So 6 years after the death itself and 3 years after the Michael Brown incident and tragedy, which also led to the real organization and beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. Back in St. Louis again, where Josh is currently, where I'm from, where Bob has lived for 4 years of his life, there are again protests in response to the verdict. So the verdict came back. They were deciding on 2 charges that had been put on Stockley. The first charge was first-degree murder, and the second charge was armed criminal action. The judge, in a 30-page verdict, wrote that Stockley would not be convicted for those 2 charges, for the first-degree murder and the armed criminal action. So on Friday, large protests broke out in St. Louis. I didn't see anything other than Facebook Live videos or news organization videos. I know in Kansas City, on the news, they were talking about it, so it was at least regionally known. I imagine to some extent nationally discussed. And I honestly had not heard anything about it until Thursday night when I saw people, some Facebook friends commenting on that this verdict, which they expected to go as it did, would lead to more protests of the sort that have happened in its aftermath. And just to refresh, or probably even just to clarify for some people, I'm going to read Missouri's first-degree murder statute. So the first-degree murder penalty reads, a person commits the crime of murder in the first degree if he or she knowingly causes the death of another person after deliberation upon the matter. So it's important in first-degree murder charges to have a clear premeditation that goes into the murder itself. Now, murder, as is defined by the law, is the unlawful killing of another with malice. So it's different from manslaughter, that while both are unlawful killings of another person, murder involves malice while manslaughter does not. Murder in the first degree is separate from murder in the second degree. Murder in the first degree is that premeditation. The caveat there, to actively have thought about and planned another's death at your own hands. Murder in the second degree is any other murder. So heat of the moment, maybe not quite self-defense, which could be manslaughter, but in between self-defense and premeditation is a second-degree murder. So are you guys cool if I editorialize just a bit here?
Yeah, totally.
Great. So I'll kick off the conversation, I guess. And first-degree murder based on that charge within the state of Missouri then comes to the judgment of the jury. The jury has to determine with the available evidence whether or not the killer acted maliciously and with premeditation upon the victim that he or she has killed. So what we do know about Smith's death is he was killed on the fifth bullet, the fifth shot by Stockley. We also know, based on forensic evidence, that there were about 15 seconds between the fourth shot and the fifth shot. So the argument for premeditation comes in those 15 seconds. Are those 15 seconds enough to determine premeditation? Far more nuanced than only that. You have to consider whether or not Stockley was acting in self-defense, whether or not Smith had a weapon on him, which is also a very iffy part of the case. There was a weapon found in the car, but only Stockley's DNA was found on the weapon. Smith's was not. And that was the weapon that allegedly belonged to Smith. We also know what's up.
Can I stop you for just a second?
Yeah.
Before we go on into even more specifics, which I think we should take the time to do, can you just break down? I think you did a really good job of breaking down first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and self-defense. But also, there's the complication of this being a police officer. Do you know a little bit more details of how that complicates it even more? Because I know that, I mean, beyond just go ahead.
Yeah, well, according to the law, I do not. I know police officers have certain protections that an ordinary citizen does not, but I couldn't find exactly what those protections are. I do know based on precedent, it's a lot harder to convict a police officer because of the nature of their job.
And anything I could pick up, I'm kind of where you are, where I don't have specific language, but pretty much what I've found through, in the past, what has worked is you just need to prove that you're acting in self-defense or in defense of another police officer, and if you can do that, you're pretty much good. That's like the precedent I've seen and I've read about. But I was just hoping that maybe you had language.
Yeah, and I wish I did, but that's what I've heard as well. So it is important to keep in mind, though, that police officers are not as readily convicted of murder as an ordinary citizen. That's part of the largest argument for the protesters in this case. Mm-hmm. So now that we've set aside what first-degree murder is, we've set aside most of the details of the moment that Stockley killed Smith. There's one other thing that we do know based on the radio, the police radio of that moment. At some point during the chase or the fight, Stockley turned to his partner and said, "Let's kill this motherfucker."
Yeah. I got the quote. He said, "We're killing this motherfucker, don't you know?" And it's supposedly like 45 seconds before he shot him.
So great. Thanks for providing that, Bob. And that's those 45 seconds between quote and shoot, and those 15 seconds between fourth shot and fifth shot are what seem to be really at the heart of whether or not the jury and the judge would convict Stockley of first-degree murder. So I'll end it with kind of my take on things, and then let's go straight into discussion. So based on what we know, it's pretty clear to me that Stockley is at the very least responsible for the death of Smith. That's objective. It's based on the fact that a bullet from a gun Stockley fired killed Anthony Lamar Smith. That cannot be denied. We know that much. So based on that, Stockley is responsible for the death. What remains at stake, though, is whether Stockley has committed a moral offense. Was this a murder? Was it an unlawful taking? In my opinion, that is without a doubt apparent. That this is an unlawful killing. The very least, according to law, it is manslaughter. According to a moral code, the taking of any life, in my opinion, even in self-defense, is not ideal. So there is a moral offense component in my mind, and that, without a doubt, is the prevailing and perhaps unanimous opinion of those who are protesting and those who are angry about this decision. But it's not quite as objective as that. So although I have that opinion, and many people do, I'm not prepared to say with certainty that I know this moral code. We have a pretty good sense with the civilizations that have survived to this day to know what is morally right and wrong. But there's still a lot of ambiguity. So there's a contingency that disagrees with this idea that there's a moral offense that Stockley committed. And as far as I can tell, the most important part of changing a system is to convince those who hold the power that the system is wrong. And I'm not sure that protesting, as our nation tends to do it right now, and even across the world, which I'll talk about later on in the podcast when we get there, is doing a very good job at changing those minds.
Yeah.
We are great at rallying and putting ourselves together and having great discussions, but I'm not always sure that it extends to the people in power, who are the ones that need their minds to change. And protesting, I think, is an absolutely essential right and a hallmark of our democracy in America. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that it is inherently good. I think very few things that we can do are inherently good. I would say it is instrumentally good in almost every case. Protesting tends to be instrumentally good. But I'm not going to sit here and condemn people who protest as being inefficient. Like, certainly they are doing more than I am, and it's not even close. I'm in Kansas City. I'll be in St. Louis next weekend, and I don't have plans to protest. Those who are seeking change, including myself and everyone else, I'd put everyone else on doing a far better job than I am at seeking that change, and they're far more active with it. But at the same time, the position I tend to take is as someone who's not convinced of protesting as being an absolute good. I like to look at the social and political context. And like I said, I do think it's an instrumental good in almost every case, but not absolute. So looking at the social and political context, I think it's really important to critically examine whether our current mold of protest can bring that sort of sustainable change that many people like to think it can. And that's protesting on either side. I mean, we had Charlottesville, 3 weeks ago, which was admittedly by the organizers of that rally. They took a page out of the left's book with protesting, and they say that on film, especially in that Vice documentary. It's a very deliberate protest, doing some attention grabbing that they hope can lead to change. But it's really, really important in the heart of all these protests that I think we look at the efficacy of the protests and whether or not they bring that sustainable change. So that's my thought on it. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then we'll keep talking.
Well, I was going to say, Josh, I think it'd be really beneficial since you are in St. Louis and on the campus of St. Louis University where a lot of these protests are happening, if you could give kind of your take on what you're seeing, because Brian, you touched on this, but being in New York, the only reason I know about this, other than maybe one article I read on the New York Times, is because I have friends that go to this school and I saw those Facebook Live pictures. Other than that, I would say a lot of the people that I interact with here have not spoken of this event at all. So I'd love to hear from a first person what you're experiencing, Josh.
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting because I kind of got to be part of this in a different way than most people because my boss at work, her husband is in charge of the public safety for St. Louis University. No, he's not in charge. Do you know what Pat Signorino's title is, Brian? I don't know. He's not in charge. But
no, he's not the leader or I guess the very top. of the Department of Public Safety, but he does run their communications, and then he has some other executive responsibilities with them too.
Yeah, so I kind of got to see a little bit from their perspective of just like what St. Louis University was doing to respond to it. Just initially, I kind of was ignorant in the sense that I really didn't know much about this case till Wednesday or Thursday when I had heard that the verdict was going to be read on Friday. Like I said, this is something that happened in 2011, so it was 6 years ago. So what? I was 16 when this happened. It wouldn't have touched on my radar, and I don't think politically at that time in the country it would have touched on many radars. We can talk about too, kind of the difference of like the reaction now versus the reaction it got in 2011. We can go into that a little bit later, but just kind of from a firsthand experience, Missouri really tried to prepare to get on top of this and be in front of it. So the Missouri National Guard has already come in the city. I believe that Governor Greitens put out a few different messages concerning what was going to happen and just say everybody has the right to protest, but we protest peacefully. We do not protest violently. And then just kind of the reaction of the school as well. Those of you who are listening at St. Louis University, you kind of know about the Occupy SLU and the Clock Tower Accords, which was when protesters came on and started camping out at St. Louis University after the killing of Mike Brown in response to the not giving the officer, Darren Wilson, not convicting him of murder. So SLU got out in front of this a lot more than they did last time. And I think that was another part of it too, is that with the Michael Brown case, everything happened so quickly. It seemed like, the killing was in August, the trial was in November, and the verdict was in November. So you're talking about a community that was really kind of, on edge of its seats for 3 months, ready to explode. This has been a lot longer timeline, so I don't know if the reaction was quite as strong. But here's what happened in St. Louis. There was probably protests of, I would say, 5,000 to 10,000 people, not nearly as big as when the Michael Brown and the Ferguson protests and those riots, because that sparked a whole national protest as well, and that was really the start of the Black Lives Matter movement, or around that time. And so really kind of the reaction has not been as big as everyone made it out to seem like it was going to be. It would be my opinion. Now, I will say one of the most surreal things is that they were protesting in the Central West End, which is about a mile west of St. Louis University campus. And it was probably 9:30 at night. And that was when this was the biggest protest that they had. And there was about 8 helicopters in the sky. And that was one of the more surreal things I've ever seen, just as far as kind of like, seeing that many helicopters in one place at one time was really interesting. So I would say the reaction here has been pretty mild. Today there was a protest on campus of around 100 to 200 people. Again, not as big as those numbers with the Michael Brown case. So I would say that the St. Louis University, I think everybody was kind of more prepared for the protest this time than we were with Michael Brown. And I think honestly that kind of probably disincentivized some protesters to coming out just because of all of the military action and police action that was being taken. So
if you could speak, what is the nature of these protests? Because you brought up like with Charlottesville, the word protest brings up so many images. So like, do you know could you take the time to describe like what you saw or what you would see in those videos, and what are the chants that we're hearing, and then like what is the call to action that these protesters are making? Because I think that'll be important for us to bring that back to Brian's point and talking about like
So I would say the main call for action is probably just the senselessness of this killing, just in the sense that he was obviously, this is a very gray area. This whole, the whole trial and everything, the evidence and kind of the events that went down, it's a very gray area. So some of the chants were very similar to a lot of the other Black Lives Matter issues, police killing African Americans, and then again, kind of like the whole system being corrupt and it needs to go. And so very kind of anti-establishment. A lot of it's very similar to the protests that have been held by other, the left in recent years. So a lot of the same lines. So it's really not anything too intricate with the case itself.
Right. And what are the demands though? Because I think that really comes back to Brian's point of what is the efficacy of these? Like, what like
Well, I think the
if you
demands
came up to
are-
one and to someone, especially like, and if it's different between SLU's campus students and the large purchase in the Central West End too, like what if you spoke to someone and they said like this is what I want, other than I guess what police brutality to stop, but like are there specific demands that we're hearing, or have we not they've not organized to that point? I just want to get a picture
I
for
have
myself.
not. I have not really heard specific demands. I'm sure if we went and talked to somebody in that group, they would obviously come up with specific demands. But I think kind of collectively, police brutality, I would say, would be the biggest one. Black Lives Matter, that kind of ongoing rhetoric is another one that I would say is the biggest one up there. So I don't know if there's necessarily specific demands as much as kind of along the same lines of just trying to bring awareness to a lot of the issues that we are already somewhat aware of.
Right.
Yes.
If I mean, I think it's worth noting that like you said, Josh, this happened December 2011, which what is a long time ago. We were in high school. I had no idea it had happened, which speaks to like the amount that I read.
I mean, I lived in
had
St.
read.
Louis and had no idea it happened.
Right. But it's interesting. So it's interesting to see like then there was very little response, but also like I think it is worth noting like 6 years ago we were having the same problems. Like if objectively we didn't move anywhere. We had the Mike Brown case earlier, right? And something similar happened. And I think that like I really don't want to take the time to like say what do we think about the case, because I think like it's a more interesting conversation to talk about everything else. But like there's a lot of sketchy things in this case, like Brian, you said that there was no DNA on the gun that was on Smith's body. The only
That
DNA
was
on
found
the gun,
in his car. Yeah.
yeah, or in his car.
And another piece that Brian did not bring up is that in Officer Wilson? No, Stockley.
Wilson
sorry.
was brown.
Yeah, so in Officer Stockley's car, they found a AK-47
Right.
that was modified with a round, a drum magazine. So one of those big, like, I don't really know how to describe them because I'm not a gun guy, but so you're not supposed to have that kind of weapon if you're on the police force. You're not supposed to have that kind of weapon in general. So that's kind of another very just shady detail of the case. So there is, I would almost say in this case, there's a lot more just kind of questionable evidence than some of the other killings of African Americans that have been protested over the past couple of years. But I do actually let's go into what you brought up originally, Bob, and I just kind of want to talk about I think something interesting is just how much the political climate has changed. Now, I don't want to speak to it because totally say it's this way because obviously 6 years ago I was 16 years old. I don't really this isn't something that would have been on my radar even if it was kind of a national outrage. But it's interesting now that we are in a time where this is getting a lot more attention than it was back in 2011. So obviously the political climate, I don't need to say this, the political climate of America has changed, but it's changed so drastically that we're now still protesting something that happened 6 years ago when there wasn't this response 6 years ago. So it's interesting, Bob, that you bring up the fact that, yes, things are still the same, but I think in a good note is that like awareness of the situation has definitely gone up a lot. And that's really the first big thing you can do. And I also want to say to it, as I've said on the podcast before, but the hard part about this is that the change is not going to come overnight. So we're at this awareness stage. Well, the next step could be 10 years from now where we actually see some true change. It's not going to happen quickly. And that's kind of the unfortunate thing about this whole protests and what the message is.
Yeah, absolutely. So along those lines, one of the reasons I'm thinking heavily about the efficacy of protests is because in the New Yorker, on the August 21st issue, so about a month ago now, there was a book review of about 5 or 6 different books written from anyone on the neo-Marxist left to the neo-Nazi right. And everywhere in between. So it looks at all these books and it finds a common thread in the way they examine protests of the past versus protests of the future. And it starts off by looking at protests back in 2003 that were protesting the Iraq War. Then it looks at protests, I think it was 2012, that were the Occupy Wall Street movement. Then it looks at Black Lives Matter, which was 2 years later. It then looks at the Women's March this past January. And within every single instance of this, it says, great, so activists today speak more about numbers and reach than about lasting results. And if you look at each of those 4 instances within the past 14 years, war in Iraq, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and the Women's March, all of them undeniably have remarkable numbers and incredible participation. That's without a doubt, and it seems to be growing. The Women's March in particular was the largest movement in United States history on a single day, but that was followed in this article by this damning sentence. Then Monday came, and the new administration went about its work as planned. And now here we are in the middle of September, and I'm not sure any of those demands from the Women's March have been met. It then goes on to also examine the Arab Spring and looking at how the Arab Spring has ended up backfiring so much in terms of the power structure that has emerged from the vacuum it created. But then it later on goes in and looks at, why did civil rights protest work where recent activism struggles? And its conclusion I found very, very kind of revolutionary in the sense that what we speak to when we talk about protest today is that anybody can protest, and everybody has a right to protest, and some people argue everybody has a duty to protest. There was a chant that NPR reported on SLU's campus today that said, "Out of the dorms and into the street," chanting at people who are staying inside. So there's an expectation among many to protest. But what this article points out is that protests traditionally have looked for long-term results. And I say traditionally, that's the wrong word. In the past, effective protests have sought long-lasting results. And in a sense, it's kind of a circular argument, but regardless, that's what's also going on now, so we'll stick with it. Mahatma Gandhi in India gained Indian freedom because of his protests. Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States led a series of decade-long protests and movements and speeches that ended up with landmark legislation to change the way race relations exist in America. Now, did it fix them? No, clearly. 50 years later, they're still very tense. But did it do a lot to change the legislation that legally allowed those sorts of discrimination? Yes, it did. So the reason this criticism and analysis offers is that back then, the strategy component of activism was so key.
Right.
Martin Luther King didn't arise as a Twitter superstar. He had a very clear vision, and not to say that
he was a tactician.
Exactly, and that's not to say that what's going on now, the leaders of Black Lives Matter and other movements are not tacticians, but it's like having Ulysses S. Grant versus whoever was leading Iraq. And clearly, Ulysses S. Grant is one of the best strategists in American history. And I'm very much against the idea of militarizing protests, but military involvement just revolves inherently around an incredible level of strategic detail planning. And the way you get that is to have a chain of command. So kind of the democratizing of protests, as this article points out, has led, in fact, to more of an anarchism of protests, in which there's not a centralizing force into which these movements can totally rally. Is there a big, clear, broad goal? Yes. But that hasn't yet translated necessarily to extremely concrete goals that have been agreed upon and met. And are there large contingencies within the protests that have a coherent vision? Absolutely. But when you have this larger movement without a very clear central figure, it's a lot harder to organize what the goals can be.
No, I think that's an amazing point that you bring up. Like when you talk about that, especially when you said like, I feel like the main goal for a lot of modern day protests, as we saw, especially with the Women's March one, I think that one is actually like the best example. Is the main goal is numbers. It's getting people out there, right? So like they match them. So, oh, we're very successful because we have so many people that are walking and out of the dorms into the streets, and it's to me, it's almost like the altruism thing that we always talk about on the podcast, right? About like fulfilling that desire for yourself. So instead of the fulfilling the desire of doing service or something, in this one it's like filling your activism desire. And so like you go out and do this march, so you feel like you're making a difference, which is great. I think that like you should be doing that, and you should, and
Yeah, and
if
and
that's
that
what you
is
believe, you should
a
be walking.
positive. That's one of the great things about these protests.
But if I think about, and it came up when you talked about the current administration. If I think about if I was in the administration right now, and my main goal was order and control, like I want to control the masses, which unfortunately is a lot of times what government does. I think about this is probably the most like this scenario for them is super beneficial because you as an individual are going out and fulfilling your activism thing, right? You're going and marching. So then you don't feel that you need to do anything more. You don't have any further goals beyond that. You fulfilled that. So then you're going to go home, and on Monday, when I do my thing, you're going to be okay with it because you fulfilled that, right? So it's almost, you feel like you're defying the government and making a statement, but in fact, you're really not, because you've made your one statement of defiance, but you didn't do it in an organized fashion. You didn't actually challenge the government. So in fact, you've made it easier for me as the government in that situation to control you and to control those masses.
Interesting. Yeah. I haven't thought about it that way.
And something I want to bring up too is, unfortunately, as kind of a sign of our times, we've almost social media-ized our protests.
Yes.
And the fact that it's about as many shares and as views as possible. The Women's March, they made a Facebook banner that you can put on your Instagram or your Facebook profile picture. It's all these different things. But what are the long-lasting effects of that, which you talked about? And Brian, I want to talk about the two other examples you brought up, the civil rights activism and then the Mahatma Gandhi protests and peaceful protests. And what do both of those have that none of these protests have today? A figurehead, a kind of person that we can look to and kind of immortalizes all of our ideas and everything we want to see this protest come to. Name me, who was the leader of the Women's March? I know, what's her name? Madonna got up there and said, I wish I could burn this White House down. But she's not the leader of the Women's March. She went back to her mansion on Monday. Even Black Lives Matter. Who is the figurehead of this movement? But also it's not these politicians like Obama. I don't want to go into this, but he's almost kind of not done a great job as taking a figurehead role and actually making change. Where post presidency, like where are these leaders that we're looking for that these other protests had?
Well, I think coming back to my, if I want to be the evil government again in this scenario, I think about trying to keep power myself. It would be in my best interest to keep figureheads down. And I think we have evidence of that in at least in, let's say, Bernie Sanders. I'm not going to say Bernie was really a figurehead, but I think we could all probably agree here that he definitely was one of the biggest rallying forces for young people. And then we literally saw the powers that be.
He was
actively put him down. So and the thing is, this is bipartisan. That was the Democratic Party that kept him down. So like we're not. I mean, I don't want to blame them for not having a figurehead because I think there's other points too. But I think you are right, Josh, that like them not having that or this movement not having that is super detrimental. And I think that I saw something the other day, and maybe you guys know more about this, like some video of Obama where he was like stating he's coming back. I do think that he has like a long-term plan of becoming a much bigger advocate in his next few years. will he become the figurehead of this? I don't want to speak to.
Yeah.
I don't,
And
but
I've got
Well, and it's going to be interesting to see what his message is, Brian.
yeah.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say I got a couple points in response and kind of in conjunction. And first, just Josh, I've been thinking a lot about that with Obama not really being that public figure that I think a lot of people hoped he would be. Last Sunday there was a commercial I think on Fox during one of the football games, and I don't know who it was because I hate the NFL, but it was on, and it was about relief efforts for the hurricanes. And you guys might have seen this as well. There was at least, I think every living president had two things to say on it and kind of cycled through them, except for our sitting president. And obviously you can get around that by saying it's past presidents, not sitting presidents. But it was a very interesting difference that Trump was not included alongside all of our living presidents, both the Bushes, Obama, Clinton, Jimmy Carter, so that was very interesting. But I think one of the reasons, or I shouldn't say I think, I wonder if one of the reasons Obama has not yet really come out of the woodwork is because no matter your thoughts on Obama, I think Obama, along with the 43 presidents who preceded him, I'm not going to say as much about the current president. We need to see more for me to be convinced of what I'll say. But the first 44 presidents at least hold a deep reverence for the office of the President of the United States. And should Obama come out marching loudly at the very beginning, might invalidate the sitting president. It could create a precedent for future past presidents to kind of lead another group of the nation. And I think someone like Obama might be very wary of those long-term consequences. Whereas, like you said, Bob, I think there's certainly going to be a long-term plan that Obama has, but he's probably waiting for that moment, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think he's probably also waiting. He's probably saving his political capital up
Exactly.
to later in Trump's first term, so then he can use it to get whoever he wants to be elected again. I think it would probably be unwise for him to, like you said, one, disrespect the because Obama's got to be thinking like, we got to get through Trump to make sure that the role of president is still respected.
Exactly.
Right? Like, get returns to what it was. So I can't disrespect that. I 100% agree with you, Brian. And then plus, if he wastes all of his political capital now and gets a bunch of people rallied behind them, but they've got 2 more years before they got to vote, I mean, that's not a good way of playing it. He should have them rally around him when it's time to vote, and then he says, oh, you should vote for blank. I think that's definitely the smarter route for him.
Plus, the Democratic Party is kind of, I don't want to say a mess, but just very unorganized, and I don't think they have a figurehead either that they're looking at
It's seen
in
better
2020.
days.
I mean, I think, Bernie is, like, I believe the front runner, but, that's, 3 years from now is a long time. And so I want to get back to Bob's point about kind of, that I thought was very interesting, of not wanting to have protests have a figurehead. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly something that, we'll talk about the government, but they want their people to be in chaos almost. They want us to be in chaos so that we turn to them to, ask for protection, ask for security. We have the largest government in human history, and it wants to keep getting bigger. That's kind of the goal of the government, is always to take over more and more things. And so they actually benefit by not having protests with leaders, because we still have to look to the government as these people who are in charge of us, quote unquote, versus actual people outside of the government who are in charge of us. I just thought that was a very interesting point you brought up, Bob, because it's almost kind of like they want to keep us in chaos. And that, that's very much what I would say the time is right now, is just chaos. And another thing too that I would add in is we have a lot of different protests, like especially with civil rights and any other times where we've seen protests that have actually worked. It was a lot of unified people. We don't have a very unified message in America. We have, from Charlottesville all the way over to Black Lives Matter, we have thousands of protests along that spectrum. And so we don't really have a unified message that we're putting together.
Right. I also think that one, I want to make 2 points. One, that the chaos thing, I think that's very true, but it's also they want us in chaos. And this, I know this is like really pushing like conspiracy esque, but I think that it's probably true. Is that it's not just chaos. They want us to feel that we are ourselves fighting the chaos and making strides forward, and that's why they do. I really do think it's in the government's best interest that we protest. Because it makes us feel good. But I also want to say, like, looking at protest just outside of everything, like outside of just the U.S., like, what has been the efficacy of a protest ever? I mean, we have those great examples. We have the 60s with Martin Luther King. We have Mahatma Gandhi. But
those are really the only two examples.
Yeah, what I'm saying is like the French Revolution is probably like the quintessential protest. It marked its period. Like it is like exactly those ideas, those Western ideas that created it, and it still failed.
Yeah.
So it's like, when is the like? It's kind of the system itself of this is like the people's power. Has this ever really worked? And I guess I think, Brian, your point is, yes, it has worked, but only when you follow these specific parameters, and we must just never be fulfilling these parameters. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah, and I think I wouldn't say necessarily specific parameters, because that sounds a little bit too universal. But
Right.
to critically assess what the society can accommodate. And right now, we're a generation removed from MLK. We're not that far. So what the changes MLK and the civil rights movement brought, I think, allow a good model for the way we can go forth. Now, that being said, it wouldn't be the exact model. I'm not sure MLK could exist today. That sort of figurehead, it's smart
Because of social media?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that someone like MLK, who's that intelligent and that great at organizing and that charismatic and well spoken, we haven't seen someone who combines all of that with a strong social media presence.
Well, I think that also, to do that, especially in the modern age, it would take a team of people
Yes.
whose goal is to make that one person perfect. And I think we do live in like our the social media world is so self-centered. Like, it's so much about, I need to be this person, I need to self-identify as this thing, that it's hard for me to imagine a world where like 50 people give up themselves to make this figurehead. I think Obama's a good example of someone that actually did that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people really, like, in Obama's not cabinet, just his general, what's the word, just his, everyone underneath him. I think they did that. He's probably been the best example of that, of people just like, I'm going to work for this thing, meaning someone else. Like, I think
But we only have 8 years of evidence that we're looking at.
Yeah.
I mean,
Totally.
Bush, there wasn't really even social media when Bush was in the office. I mean, Obama is the first president that we've had that came up with social media, and now all of a sudden, well, it's interesting that we went, straight into Donald Trump. Who, did you see his Twitter this morning?
No, I don't shout
He
for my own
retweeted
sanity.
this GIF of him hitting a golf ball. And it hits Hillary's back, and she falls down.
Okay, that's objectively kind of funny.
Yeah, but
It's
why
just
is he
the-
still
the
talking
leader
about
of the
that?
free, the leader of
He's the
free
fucking
world
worst.
is just.
He's just like, hey, by the way, guys, remember when I beat Hillary? Like, that's like all that is.
I
that's I'm watching
I
it now.
choose to laugh more than fear. I just choose to laugh because it's if the Republic's going to end, at least it's going down kind of funny, right? That's not the right
Yeah.
connotation of funny, but I want to get into Bob's, or I just want to talk about how we separate too often. I think today, and I've been thinking about this a lot. So kind of correct me if I'm going off course. You do see some flaws in my logic, but I think today we oftentimes separate ourselves from human history way too much. We take a look at the past and we take a look at ourselves and we say, oh, we're very different than that. And that's not how we're going to be. And unfortunately, basically the only two examples we have of peaceful protests are Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And that every other protest and every other change has gone through violence and bloodshed. That's the only way to really change things. We only have these two small examples of, yes, big change, but that's a limited number. And I think, unfortunately, too, something I've been thinking about just with the essence of the American government and can we fix the system? I don't think you can fix the system. It seems to me, especially, I'm just trying to kind of like with my limited knowledge, once you lock in one single path, it's kind of, you're constantly going to go down that path. There'll be changes, but there's not really a way to drastically change it without completely getting rid of the system itself. And so I think that's another problem that we're fighting is that, like, that's why I don't think universal healthcare will ever happen, is because we went so long in a system without universal healthcare that you just can't throw universal healthcare into this system of government. Now, that's just an anecdote to say, kind of summarize my point. But I think if we wanted to have universal healthcare, we'd have to completely restructure the government and, you know, almost upend it. And unfortunately, the way that has happened in human history has been through bloodshed and violence. And I don't want to say that that's what's going to happen again because I have no idea. But I think, unfortunately, that's a reality we have to face.
I want to comment on just your first point. I can let Brian talk after that about looking back in history. I think that's probably one, like, humans not learning from history has definitely been a trend from the beginning of time. But I think a different reason of why, I think that the problem that we have as humans, especially now, because I think that we are very cognizant of that because we are big studiers of history, is not that we don't read history, although clearly there is an absence of that. Like, clearly that is true. But I think that we also have this cockiness to us that it's like we look at the past and we see the lessons of the past and we assume that we have learned those lessons in their complete fullness. So we're like, oh, we saw Martin Luther King march. So all of the things we learned in the civil rights movement, we know that. And we just make that assumption like, I've got that. I know everything about that because I know inherently that was right. So I'm just going to go on living assuming I know that information. When that's like, that is most definitely not true. Like, I know personally I've not read nearly enough of Martin Luther King's writings or his tactical moves to really understand that. But I mean, I've definitely grown up my whole life being like, oh, I know this lesson. Oh, the Civil War was evil. I don't need to know. Like, it's we just assume that we already know all of those follies because we read about them lightly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and so I love that you brought up that point. My roommate Jamie introduced me to this quote from John Locke, the English philosopher who was responsible for much of Thomas Jefferson's ideological upbringing when he wrote the Declaration of Independence and Constitution of the United States. He's the founder of modern liberalism, as we know it in a democracy. And a great quote of his says, "Reading furnishes the mind only with materials of knowledge. It is thinking that makes what we read ours." And at a time like now, I don't think could be any more salient. I know for myself, I read and mark this shit out of everything. Like, I make my students mark up their books to the extent that they have paper books to mark up. And I require that because it's so critical that we think critically. And we're not just reading and taking in, because I've taken in so much information in my life. All of us have, more than anyone in the history of the United States, just by nature of our digital age. And the vast majority of it I've forgotten. So
right, and I think I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I just want to make the really short point that, like, when making a quote, right? I think that you reading and annotating a book with, like, underlining important quotes is really important. But I think the most important thing is, like, if you're gonna give a quote, you better comment on what that quote means to you. You know what I mean? Like, I think that we, like, even if you look at our Instagram, I like putting quotes out there, but every time I do that, if you look in the description, you're going to see a little bit of a commentary on that quote. Because I think if just giving the quote itself is meaningless, and I think that the way that quote that you just gave there is a beautiful way of saying that. Like, if you're not, like, in my books, I always end, if it's like a book that, you know, if it's not just for fun reading, if it's like I have a Emerson book that I always comb through. Yeah. At the end, I always have, like, my responses. And I'm sure, Brian, you've seen this too in teaching. Like, if you're discussing something in in theology, you're reading a quote, like one of the things you're going to have you do is you're going to have your students turn and talk about it, right?
Yeah.
Like that's where that real learning occurs. It's not by this memorization or hearing a nicely phrased sentence.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. And I think that's very well said, Bob.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we're in this information overload age where we have to do this, but we can't, like, we don't have time to critically evaluate all the information we're taking in. So it's kind of, we're balancing this fine line of how much time do I actually spend thinking about the information I'm bringing in, because constantly information is coming in and going out. And so how do we move forward and actually figure out how to critically evaluate so much information at one time? Like you said, Brian, we're just taking in more than any other humans in history,
right?
Maybe even combined. Like, I don't want to say that, but just I can learn about what's happening in Yemen right now, and that was not available to people even 20 years ago. So we have all these different struggles that we've never had before, and so I mean, we're really in some sort of turning point of history, and it's really, really interesting to be a part of.
Yeah.
When I think like bringing that quote that you brought up back to these protests, I mean, it really, and maybe I don't think I'm alone in thinking this, of thinking about like that. Brian, you brought up that a lot of the movements nowadays, their goal is numbers. It's out of the dorms into the streets. And I really fear that a lot of our college students, I wasn't at St. Louis University for this protest, but I definitely was during the Michael Brown ones. And I think, and I know it's kind of a negative opinion to think about, but like how many of those students are walking around with a quote rather than walking around with their dissection of a quote?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's almost kind of like the name of this podcast too, is entitled to My Friend's Opinion. You are taking somebody else's quote and just utilizing it as your own without putting your own opinion on it. And so, yeah, I think that's a very good point to bring up, is just, we're walking around with signs and simple catchphrases, but have we really critically thought about what they mean?
And I love that. And one thing to tie all of this together too, I saw the best breakdown of what Black Lives Matter really means in terms of its name. And this was the other day on Facebook on Friday or Saturday. It was not a friend of mine, so I don't know what the name is, but it was a comment on a friend's post. And the post just read, Black Lives Matter. It was by one of my former bosses, Andrea Hitzman, and she's very active in social justice. And underneath the quote, there was a debate about what that means. Black Lives Matter. Okay, we have this All Lives Matter movement, this Blue Lives Matter movement, but Black Lives Matter is where it started. And I've long not had the words to express kind of the way I think about it. And someone commented in the wake of Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma, they said, saying all lives matter is like saying all states matter, in response to government funding for Florida and Texas right now. And I thought that was just a really effective way to say something that has become so heated. And it was very calm, and it was very matter of fact and not bringing anyone down. But it was just to make that analogy, to hear that quote that so many people just repeat, Black Lives Matter, and analyze it for the purpose that it's hoping to serve. There is a stronger need right now to provide aid to the victims of Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma than there is to, let's say, I don't know, something that I like have a new road paved in Kansas City, Missouri that I hit a pothole in yesterday. There's just a more dire need for that right now. And based on citation of various statistics, the argument of Black Lives Matter, which I agree with, is there is a stronger need right now to highlight the sanctity of a Black American's life than a middle-class white American's life. Because at stake, we know that life is important. But sometimes we need a reminder that our lives are all equal, in the sense that we all deserve that same level of respect for our life that our neighbor gets.
Wow. I think that's a great place to end because this is a conversation that could go on for a long, long time. And I think we've really only just scratched the surface as far as what we could have talked about. And so actually, I think that this might be something that's beneficial to talk about on an upcoming podcast or a version of this.
Agreed.
But wow, I think this was a really interesting podcast. It's, we got to take a look at the way we protest and what we are protesting and the, the language that we use with the protest and what that means to us. Because, I think if you went into a crowd of, a Black Lives Matter protest, how many different definitions of Black Lives Matter would you get? Yeah. There's almost not even a unified message within Black Lives Matter. I'm not, I'm just using that as an example. I'm not saying that there isn't a unified message, but I think everybody's definition would be, I don't know if it'd be different or if it'd be similar. I don't know. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and my final word I'd just like to say is being a St. Louis native, living away from St. Louis, having many friends and family that I love dearly still in St. Louis. It's for a city that for years has been a bastion of regressivism. It is kind of nice to see, even if the change isn't apparent right now. Hopefully, it will be ultimately this progressivism that has taken hold in at least St. Louis City, and hopefully St. Louis County will respond positively, and hopefully the city too will have a net positive come from everything that's happening right now.
Absolutely. We really need it here in St. Louis.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to say this was one of my favorite podcasts we've done in a while. Because I think that was cool is like Brian, myself, Josh have very different political leanings, and I think they're even growing further apart as we have moved far apart, and our experiences have become like our literal day experiences day by day have grown so different. But I also think it's really cool when we come back and we have this conversation about like this place that we all care about and know and take the time to read about, but can still come to this similar understanding, even though I think we're coming from different sides of the political leanings and anything, right? But we still come together and say like, hey, let's talk about some of these problems that are happening beyond this. If we really want humanity in the United States to move in a better place, and we can kind of find common grounds, even though we're all across the country. I think that was, for me, it was really enjoyable to do today.
Yeah, that was awesome, and thank you guys so much. And to the Entitled family out there, please keep giving us reviews on iTunes. That really helps us out a lot. Please share this with a friend. We love these conversations. We love having them, but we want to have as many people listen to them as possible, obviously. So thank you guys for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.